Join former FBI senior forensic examiners Becky Passmore and Stacey Eldridge as they dig into the world of digital forensics, one bite at a time. Now leading their own consulting firms and educating the next generation of cyber sleuths. These badass babes of digital forensics bring sharp insight, real-world case experience, and a dose of humor to the bits and bytes that build today's investigations. From deep dives into business email compromise and ransomware attacks, Becky's specialty, to cracking the complexities of iPhone forensics, Stacey's obsession. This podcast delivers insider knowledge for professionals, students, and true crime techies alike. If you've ever wondered what really happens when the digital trail is all that's left, tune in and start parsing the truth.
Hello, and welcome back to Parsing the Truth One Bite at a Time, where we cut through digital noise to reveal how investigations really unfold. I'm your host, Stacey Eldridge, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Becky Passmore. In today's episode, we're talking about the Thing About Pam.
Well, hello, everyone. Yeah, Stacey, tell me a little bit about this Thing About Pam.
Well, according to Dateline NBC, she's a woman that's as cagey as they come. And this story is about the evil that smiles, that worms its way into unsuspecting minds and kills. This is about such a woman we have never seen.
Oh my gosh, we are talking about Pam Hupp. She's been in the news off and on since 2011. Not only has she been the focus of several Dateline NBC episodes, my favorite, an entire Dateline NBC podcast series, numerous other podcasts, and even Hulu has a series featuring Renee Zellweger called The Thing About Pam.
Yes. And while we're going to focus on the digital evidence in this case, we certainly have to get everyone up to speed on what the cases involved. And yes, I said cases, plural. And at the end, we'll share some recent news on the case too. But this story begins days after Christmas in 2011 with the brutal murder of Betsy Faria, a terminally ill mother in Troy, Missouri. And this is just outside of St. Louis. Her husband, Russ Faria, was convicted of her murder in November 2013. And the man had a really good alibi. We're talking receipts, video footage, and even cell phone tower data.
Yeah, enter Pam Hupp, Betsy's seemingly devoted friend, who was the last person to see Betsy alive, and shockingly named the sole beneficiary of Betsy's life insurance policy just days before her death. So in February of 2015, the Missouri Court of Appeals ordered a new trial for Russ, her husband, due to the previously suppressed evidence implicating Pam Hupp. In November of 2015, Russ's bench trial resulted in an acquittal after having spent nearly 3.5 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit.
Now, it doesn't end there. In August 2016, Pam shoots and kills Louis Gumpenberger in her home. The evidence doesn't support her self-defense claim. And in June 2019, Pam entered an Alford plea for this murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole in August of 2019. The investigation into Betsy's murder was recently reopened, and Pam was charged with her murder in July 2021. Jury selection is expected to begin next summer in July, with a trial date set for August 2026.
Let's dig into that digital evidence in this case. Police seized Pam's cell phone and later returned it. And then the police viewed the call logs on Betsy's daughter's, Leah's, cell phone from her to Betsy, showing that the unanswered calls were on the night of Betsy's murder. The police seized from the Faria's home 2 cell phones, assumingly one from Betsy and one from Russ, 4 laptops and computers, 3 hard drives, a thumb drive, an iPod, 2 MP3 players, and more than 200 CD-RWs, and a Fuji film camera. We also know cell tower records were subpoenaed for both Russ and Pam's phones. records.
And we got some insider knowledge. They said it's 4 laptops, and then they said computers. We were told it's probably like about 10 different computers and laptops in total. So, I mean, there's a fair amount of potential digital evidence in this case. And basically, the way we're going to go through this episode is we're going to be discussing the digital evidence in the order in which it came up in during the different interviews, depositions, and trials. Now, on the day of the murder, the cell phone data does show text between Betsy and Russ, the husband and wife, discussing things for the house and plans for the evening. Russ was going to game night, Betsy had chemo, and she had shared that Pam Hupp wanted to bring her home. Betsy stated, and I quote, "She offered and I accepted." Betsy also called Russ at 5 p.m. to remind him about the ride from Pam and that she had some good news to share when she got home.
Seems like pretty typical husband and wife stuff to me.
I agree. But let's keep in mind there are some key words from Betsy about Pam regarding that ride home. She offered and I accepted.
Yeah, Russ left gaming night and stopped at Arby's and ate in the car on the way home. He also called Betsy, but she didn't answer. He estimated he arrived home at around 9:45 p.m. And upon entering the house, he spotted Betsy dead in front of the sofa. It was a bloody scene. A knife was sticking out of her neck. He immediately called 911. This 911 call would later be used against him in trial.
And now let's go backwards to the morning of the murder. Betsy texted Pam. She said, "Bobby is going and I want to spend some one-on-one time with her." And this is at 10:35 a.m. in the morning, and they're talking about Betsy's chemo session. And then 1 minute later, Pam replied, "Bummer." However, Pam still showed up at Betsy's chemo session. And then at 3:46 p.m., Betsy texted Russ that Pam would bring her home. Pam says she drove back to Betsy's mom's around 5:15 p.m. and didn't leave there with Betsy until about 6 p.m. Pam called her husband when she arrived at Betsy's house and left a voicemail, with Betsy also leaving a holiday greeting. Because remember, this is around Christmas time. And then from there, Pam gives several different versions of what happened that night, where her actions, times, and the calls all varied. So that's why the cell phone evidence becomes so important in this case. And that's because the cell phones will log the times of those calls, those text messages, and even missed calls. But you have to know how to read and analyze those logs, as you will later see in this case. Any cell phone tower data can provide clues to the location of a cell phone. And notice I said location of the cell phone. You, as the examiner, have to do additional work to tie a person to the cell phone.
Yeah, that's right. So Pam's cell phone revealed a call to her husband at 7:04 p.m. And then another call was registered at 7:27 p.m. to Betsy, which would have been the call Pam said she made when she arrived at home. But then her story changed to either being close to home or on the road. Pam then called Betsy's mom at 8:52 p.m. asking her to check on Betsy since she hadn't heard back. And so here we have 3 good timestamps of 7:04 p.m., 7:27 p.m., and 8:52 p.m.
Pam had also shared during various police interviews that when she and Betsy were at the tennis club the week before, Betsy had said that she had wrote a message to Pam and that she had shared something really disturbing that Russ had said to her in that message. But Betsy never sent it. But it was on her computer in some form. And Pam was saying that Betsy couldn't send it because Russ had been going through her emails. And she couldn't print it because the printer was in Russ's home office. And the funny thing is, over time, Pam basically shared all of the contents of that letter during her various interviews and mentioned several times how the police needed to find that letter.
So the police returned to Pam's house later on the 28th, and this time asked for more details about where she had been when she called Betsy at 7:27 p.m. This time the answer was 10 or 15 minutes after leaving Betsy's. Now, this is where you could see cell phone tower data to confirm that Pam was on the road headed towards her house.
Yeah, so that's if you have the cell phone tower records, take a
Right.
minute and double check that information. Where does it say she is at that point in time? And I'm mentioning this because this is going to come into play as her story changes over time.
Mhm.
Now, during the fourth visit to Pam's house from law enforcement, and this is now Thursday evening, 2 days after the murder, the police speak with Mark, Pam's husband. Mark played them a voicemail from Pam with Betsy leaving that holiday greeting as well. The police failed to seize this phone, and then Mark, the husband, later deleted that voicemail. During this same interview, they didn't ask him what time Pam had arrived home that evening. They didn't ask what she was wearing. And they didn't ask if Pam said anything after she finally returned home that night.
Yeah, all missteps there. Russ stated and his gaming friends corroborated that he was with them 25 miles away from the Fiera home from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock p.m. Additionally, the police verified everything Russ said he had done to and from the game night, and they spotted him on a video. While the video camera at Arby's was broken, the bag and receipt were found in Russ's car. Although the police felt he should have arrived home at 9:31, 9 minutes before the 911 call, now the police think that he should have arrived home even sooner. Again, this is where cell phone tower records can confirm or refute Russ's provided timeline.
Betsy had a daughter, Leah. The police checked Leah's phone and confirmed she called Betsy at 7:21 p.m., 7:26 p.m., and 7:30 p.m., and all three calls went unanswered. Here, they're visually looking at the phone logs directly on the phone. So just like you would as a person using your own phone to see what calls you missed and who you called someone last, that sort of thing. So it's important to know what the symbols on that phone mean for missed versus unanswered versus checking your voicemail, etc. And that's important because this was all the different types of information about those phone calls that was introduced during the trial.
Exactly. So during the trial, the defense tried to introduce that Pam's 7:04 and 7:27 p.m. calls were made from the same cell phone tower. The judge didn't let it in since it was related to suggesting that Pam committed the murder, which had already been blocked. And now this would have been interesting if it had been admitted, because if Pam's phone was using the same cell phone tower at 7:04 p.m. and 7:27 p.m., it could mean that she wasn't on the road at 7:27 p.m. as she claimed. So you would need to do some analysis to determine what approximate reach of the tower was. There are people that specialize in this. In fact, the FBI has a team, and that team goes through extensive training to be able to triangulate and place a cell phone in a certain area based on its ping to the towers. So was it possible for Pam to be 10 to 15 minutes away from the Fair house and still be connected to the same cell tower that she used when she called her husband at 7:04 p.m.? Big question there. The defense did introduce that Russ's cell phone tower pings indicate that the earliest he could have arrived home was 9:38 p.m.
Now, during the trial, the defense is focusing hard on that 7:27 p.m. phone call, especially with the time of death being placed between 7 and 7:20 p.m. The defense asked Pam about her statements about not going into the house and then later telling police she went into the house and into the bedroom. And then Pam says she doesn't remember telling Betsy's mom she didn't go in. She also started backpedaling on saying she called Betsy at 7:27 p.m. to say home. She did agree that it would be impossible to be home by 7:27 p.m. since they live 23 miles apart at least, and that's based on the distance between the towns. And she said that later she's claiming that she calls from the interstate and says, "I'm home," which means I'm on my way home. And that seems crystal clear to me.
Exactly. Yeah. So, a member of the Major Case Squad's Technical Operations Group testified his analysis of the phone showed that Russ called his mother at 5:22 p.m. And then there was a call from Betsy's mom at 8:57 p.m. that went to voicemail. When asked if Russ listened to that voicemail, the witness said, yes, a call to the number listed as voicemail took place 30 seconds later. On cross, he later admitted that Betsy's mom's missed call would still be connected to the voicemail 30 seconds later, and he wouldn't be able to retrieve it yet. In the end, there was no evidence that Russ listened to that voicemail.
When it's time for the defense to make their case, they call Greg Chatton to the stand. He's a digital forensics expert with a specialty in cellular mapping and data forensics that requires a license that's issued by the Missouri Board of Professional Regulation. So he does something very similar to what that FBI team does that Becky was talking about. He's just not in law enforcement, but he does have the credentials and that certification to support that he would be an expert in this in court. Fortunately, Greg passed away last year in 2024, so we're not able to speak with him about his testimony. However, we have his testimony, and during that testimony, Greg explains that the data plotted on the map, and he's showing it to the jury, and he indicated that at 5:07 and 5:08 and 5:10 p.m., Russ's phone was in the sector that included his home. Then later at 5:11, 5:13, and 5:22 p.m., it was in the same sector as the Conoco service station. And we have more good cell phone data that he talks about. At 5:50 p.m., the phone was in the area close to Lake St. Louis and O'Fallon. And at 7:50 p.m., it was in the area of the game night house. Finally, at 9:25 p.m., it was at least 10 miles away from Russ's home. And then the phone finally arrived back in the area of the house at 9:37 p.m. And it sounds like Greg did a lot of work based on the subpoena data that they received back from Russ's cellular provider, combining it with the coverage area for each cell phone tower, and he's lining it up with his alibi. And so, we didn't go into his alibi, but Russ gave a lot of information. He said, I went here, here, and here on my way to game night. And then after game night, I left about this time. I stopped at Arby's. And so they have all of this video. The video lines up with Russ's alibi. And then further, Greg has the cell phone tower data that further lines up with Russ's alibi. And so it's very powerful to be able to have that sort of information corroborated. I mean, that's the thing we want to do. If we can have two things match up from different sources, that's really supposed to be a slam dunk. However, the defense was not allowed to share any of Pam's cell phone data to the jury during the trial. And I say they weren't allowed to share it to the jury because there was some discussion, basically a voir dire that went on during the trial, but the jury was dismissed, so they didn't get to hear it. But it's out in open court, and that's how we know that it exists. Because even if the jury's not in the room, the transcriptionist is still typing that's everything that's being said when the mics are on in the courtroom.
That's right.
Sadly, sidebars are not transcribed. Sometimes I'd like to know what the heck is going on in the sidebar, right?
Right, exactly. You want to know what's being said over there. Yeah, this is great data. So because this is such good data, not only do they have Russ on the video and the Arby's receipt that matches up, they have that cell phone tower data that's corroborating his timeline and the video. So later, while the prosecution asked Greg if he only testifies for the defense, he replied yes, because the police and prosecutors have state labs that did such work for them. He also was asked why he wouldn't discuss his testimony with the prosecution during the lunch break. He said he thought she was getting into the defense trial strategy and that it would be inappropriate.
I find that kind of odd myself that the prosecutor would have come up to a defense witness and
I thought it
started
was against the
asking.
rules.
Yeah, I don't know. I even had in a recent trial, the prosecuting attorney call me, but he just called me out of the blue. It's a phone call, right? And it's a person saying a name and that they're a prosecutor or whatever. And he was like, "What are you going to testify about?" And I was like, "The cell phone." I kind of answered real generically because, of course, I'm not sure like who this is, and I hadn't received a warning call that he was going to be calling or anything like that. And then my answers were just kind of like, "Oh, well, we've not narrowed it down yet." Because again, I wasn't sure, like, it's just a phone call. I'm not sure what I can and cannot
Right.
say.
Right. And I say against the rules. I think it's more ethical, moral. Like, that the defense has their strategies and their witnesses, then prosecution has their strategies and their witnesses, and trying to figure out what that is through a witness, I would say is, more of a moral or ethical standpoint than a rule.
Right. And even when you go out to like lunch during a trial, like you don't know who's around you. So
Sure.
you have to basically, not say anything
Right.
about anything related to the trial because you don't know who's listening. So,
That's right.
but anyways, later on the redirect, the defense asked Greg if his role as a defense witness affects the results of his analysis. Now, here, Greg gets to say what we all want to say when we're testifying. He says, "I'm a fact finder, whether I do cell mapping or forensics. The fact is the fact, the data is the data." He also confirmed his answers would not have been any different if he had been hired by the state. When he was asked by the prosecution how they would know that, he states that they should hire him.
I love that. That is such a great response, and it is so true, right? I mean, that's why that's the name of this podcast. We come up with the truth for you. So I love that. I love his response. The facts is the facts, the data is the data. He's a fact finder. That's so great. So after the state's rebuttal, the defense calls Greg back to the stand while the jury is out. He confirms in open court, no jury, but open court, that Pam's cell was in the same tower sector as Betsy's house at 7:04 p.m. and at 7:27 p.m. She couldn't have made the 7:27 p.m. call from Highway 61 south of Troy or at her home in O'Fallon. Unfortunately, the judge refused to let the jury hear that information. Denied again because of the previous ruling that Pam couldn't be introduced as a suspect by the defense.
During closing arguments, the state introduces a new theory that Russ left his phone at the game night house. And the defense was quick to clap back during their closing argument that there was nothing to prove that. And that, is going back to what we said earlier. You have to do some extra work to say that the person is with their phone. Because, of course, people could leave their phones behind.
Sure, absolutely. The jury deliberates and asks for maps of cell phone locations and cell phone towers and the videos from the police as they drove the routes Russ said he traveled. The jury returned the same day at 4:30 p.m., 5 hours later, and found him guilty of murder in the first degree and armed criminal action. He was sentenced to life without parole.
So now the work begins on the appeal. And I think this is a good stopping point for this episode before we continue on to the results of the appeal and the murder of Louis Gumpenberger. But let's talk about the digital evidence here for a while. Becky, remind us what digital evidence was collected.
Yeah, so Pam's cell phone was collected, call logs on Leah's cell phone from the Fiera's house, 2 cell phones, assuming one was Betsy and one was Russ's, 4 laptops and computers, 3 hard drives, a thumb drive, an iPod, 2 MP3 players, and more than 200 CD RWs and a Fujifilm camera. Cell phone tower records for Russ and Pam's phones.
Yeah, and then going back to that insider knowledge that we got about this case from the person who processed the digital evidence, he said that the 10 computers came to his lab, but he never received Betsy's cell phone or Betsy's laptop when this case initially came into the office.
Yeah.
And before it went to trial the first time during Betsy's phone and her laptop never made it to his lab before Russ's trial the first time around. And then eventually we know it gets examined later on, but I think it was interesting that it was never initially examined.
Right.
Why it sat where it sat and didn't get immediately examined, we don't know why. But like in any case, there's so much evidence and you have to make some calls about what do you want
What's priority?
prioritize.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep. And I mean, if she was the victim, maybe they thought, well, her laptop isn't important. We want to look at her husband's stuff to see if he was researching how to kill someone, if he was telling people he was going to kill someone. But they didn't introduce any evidence from any of his devices to introduce anything like that at all during the trial. It was really just his cell phone evidence, those call logs. And then there was the confusion over whether he listened to that voicemail or did not. And then after they thought about it matter of factly, that because the voicemail was so long, he wouldn't have been able to retrieve that voicemail because it was still being left. And so again, that goes back to being able to, know how to read your logs. And there's been some other stuff in the news lately too, where there's been some misreading of symbols that come out in the digital forensics tools that have led some people to make some incorrect conclusions. And let's kind of go loop it back around to Pam. I mean, this is the thing about Pam, right?
Right.
And so with her cell phone evidence, the main focus was the 2 calls from Pam's cell phone to her husband, and then the location of that 7:27 p.m. phone call, because that was hotly debated by the defense. And the other interesting thing to me too was that during the trial, the text from Betsy to Pam
Yep.
were ruled as hearsay. Initially, I wasn't sure why, but it makes sense now since we found out that they didn't do anything with Betsy's phone in terms of an extraction and examining it and things of that nature. So,
Right. Yep.
I think it would have been important for those texts to get in because it goes towards like, why is Pam trying to be with Betsy, but Betsy's declining and she's showing up anyways? And why did Pam have to be there that day? Why did Pam have to drive Betsy home that day? Why was she so adamant?
Exactly. It's all looking away from where they probably should have focused the target at that time, but not knowing, because a lot of times, the focus goes on the person that is closest to them, which is many times the spouse. So the defense got in that Betsy missed 3 phone calls from Leah. She promised she would answer. So that too, they got those in, but then other things were left out.
Yep. And in terms of Russ's cell phone data, they only focused on the call with his mom before game night, then the missed call from Betsy's mom that went to the voicemail, and we've talked about that. And we've alluded to this. That's that tricky part with the voicemail. You've got to know is it going to voicemail? Is it retrieving the voicemail? And, how you access your voicemail has certainly changed over time. Like, remember back in the day when you would call your own cell phone number to get to voicemail, or you could dial like *86 to get to your voicemail. So,
Right.
It would be important to know, like, what does *86 do? And, who are they calling? What does that mean? Oh, it's just them checking their voicemail. It's nothing nefarious.
Right.
So it's important to know what that stuff means. And as we've talked about before, the wheels of justice turn slowly. So it's important to be able to go back in time and see, okay, what were we doing 5 years ago, 7 years ago, especially when you get into appeals and retrials. It certainly drags on. And, you're talking like a decade later. And in this case, when Pam goes to trial, that's going to be 15 years after the murder occurred.
Right.
So it's a long time. And being able to go back through digital evidence like that is hard. And that's what makes us hoarders in so many ways, right? It's like, I got to keep my floppy disk. I've got to keep my notes about Windows XP because I don't know when I'm ever going to have to examine that again. I can't get rid of anything ever.
Right. Right. I'm going back in the day, like 15 years ago, to look at evidence. It's going to be tried 15 years after the case. And yeah, you got to you got to have all those tools and, notes as well where evidence lies.
Right. And I mean, say the state, the prosecution, they had their examiners do the analysis back then, they have what they have. And so that would be like relevant and fresh in their minds back in like 2011, maybe when they were doing some initial examinations. But now that it's going to trial in 2026, they're calling a new defense expert now because, and we have to remember the other thing that plays into this is Greg has passed away. So any analysis that he may have done during the first trial, he's no longer there to give that testimony. So they're going to have to bring in another defense expert, and they're certainly battling that 15-year gap of time and going to have to figure all this out going backwards in time.
Exactly. That's exactly right. There's no mentions of anything from the laptops, computers, hard drives, thumb drives, iPod, MP3 players, CD-RWs, or the camera. So no mentions yet.
Now, the defense did get to share the maps of Russ's cell phone tower data. However, while the cell phone tower data was shared in open court, the jury never got to hear about how Pam's phone was still at the tower for Betsy's house at 7:27 p.m. And again, that's because of the ruling not allowing the defense to point the finger at Pam for Betsy's murder. And we'll be talking more about Pam next week.
Yeah. So thank you to our listeners. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and coworkers, subscribe, and join us for more episodes. And until next time, stay safe, stay sharp, and as always, keep parsing the truth one bite at a time.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us to get notified the next time a new episode drops. If you can do more, head on over to parsingthetruth.com and donate by clicking on the donate button. Parsing the Truth is a nonprofit organization, and we are raising money to send a new digital forensic examiner to IASIS training next year in Orlando. Thanks.